The human took the strike meant for her, and an ancient power awakened. Part 2. Into the corridor. The argument lasted most of the night. Not a loud argument. Nobody raised their voice. The people aboard the Ardent Horizon were diplomats and officers. They were trained to disagree without the disagreement looking like one. But the tension in the ship's main conference room was real, and it pressed against the walls the way heat does in a small space. The Aelthori wanted to ignore the signal. Advisor Selvara stood at the far end of the table and made the case in her clean, even voice. The pre-collapse era was over 4,000 years ago. Any signal from that time was either a residual echo with no meaning or a trap left by a civilization that no longer existed. Chasing it would pull the ship off course. It would delay the peace negotiations. It would give the Draveth Collective, already difficult, more time to reconsider their attendance. The risk was not worth the unknown. The Soon delegate agreed with her, which surprised everyone, because the Soon rarely agreed with the Aelthori on anything. The Myrick observer said nothing. They almost never did. Commander Lou Ashford listened to all of it without expression. He sat at the head of the table, with his hands flat on the surface, and his eyes moving from face to face, while the arguments went around the room. When everyone had said their piece, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the signal had been there before anyone arrived in this corridor. It had been there for 4,000 years, without anyone answering it. If it was a trap, it was the most patient trap in galactic history. He said the Ardent Horizon was going to change course and take a look. The diplomatic session would be postponed by 48 hours. Selvara looked at him the way a person looks at someone who has just made a decision they consider unwise but constitutional. She did not argue further. She simply sat down. Calvin, sitting 2 seats to Ashford's right, wrote nothing in his notes. He just watched the room settle into its unhappy silence and thought that sometimes the most important thing a commander could do was make a decision, even an imperfect one, and hold it. The Ardent Horizon changed course. They entered the deeper part of the Veth corridor the following morning. The corridor itself was not dramatic to look at. Space rarely was. It was dark, with the usual scatter of distant stars and the faint color of a nebula somewhere far to the left. But the ship's sensors had been reading unusual data since they crossed the outer boundary. Electromagnetic patterns that did not match natural sources. A faint gravitational pull from something large and stationary ahead. And the signal, still repeating, low and patient, like a knock on a door, from someone who was not in a hurry. Ashford assembled an away team for the scout craft. Calvin volunteered before anyone asked him. Nora Bain came up from the lower decks with a bag full of scanning equipment, and no particular need to be invited. 2 security officers rounded out the group, along with the ship's lead navigator, a Yoth named Kreth, who communicated through color shifts in the skin around its neck. Selvara arrived at the scout bay as they were boarding. She said she was joining the team. When the security officer on duty started to explain that the manifest was already set, she looked at him with the specific kind of calm that Aelthori used when they were explaining that the conversation was already over. She said the Aelthori civilization had a historical interest in any pre-collapse discovery. She said she had a right to be present. She stepped past the officer and boarded the craft. Calvin said nothing. He picked up his bag and followed her in. The scout craft left the Ardent Horizon and moved through the corridor for about 2 hours. Then Nora looked up from her scanning equipment and said quietly, "There." It was not what any of them expected. They expected wreckage, debris, the scattered remains of something that had broken apart a long time ago. What they found instead was a structure. It was enormous. It was intact. It drifted without power, without motion, turning very slowly in the dark, the way a sleeping thing turns in its sleep. Its shape was not like any architecture in the ship's database. It had long, curved sections that connected to a central body, and the surface of it was covered in carvings from end to end. Not random marks, patterns, glyphs, thousands and thousands of them, all interlocking, all precise, all clearly made by something with a great deal of time and a great deal of intention. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Kreth's neck shifted to a deep blue-gray, which on a Yoth meant something close to reverence. They docked at what appeared to be an entry point on the structure's lower section. The seal opened without resistance, as if it had been waiting for someone to press it. The air inside was thin but breathable. The light inside came from the walls themselves, a faint, even glow with no visible source. Their footsteps made no sound. Selvara moved through the first corridor quickly, scanning with her own device, her long fingers moving over each glyph she passed. She said twice that none of the patterns matched any known Aelthori historical archive. The second time she said it, she sounded less pleased about that fact than the first time. She photographed everything. She did not rush. She had the approach of someone who understood that the worst thing you could do with something fragile and rare was hurry past it. Calvin walked between them and said very little. He was reading the space rather than the walls. The layout of the corridors, the spacing of the chambers, the way the structure felt to move through. It felt to him like a building that had once been full of people and had adjusted to its own emptiness over a very long time. Not abandoned, just waiting. They reached a sealed chamber at the center of the structure after about 40 minutes of walking. The door to it was a single flat panel covered entirely in glyphs, floor to ceiling. There was no obvious handle or control mechanism. Selvara examined it for several minutes. Then she placed her hand flat against the center of the panel and pressed. The structure responded. A vibration started in the floor, deep and low, moving up through their boots. The light in the corridor brightened slightly. The glyphs around the doorframe shifted, several of them rotating like slow wheels. And then, after about 10 seconds, everything stopped. The vibration faded, the glyphs went still, the door did not open. Selvara stepped back. She held her scanner up, read the result, and said the chamber appeared inert. The response had been a passive resonance reaction, nothing more. She said there was likely nothing functional left inside. She turned and began walking back the way they came. The security officers followed. Kreth followed. Nora lingered a moment longer, then started back. Calvin stood in front of the door. He did not know why he stayed. He had no equipment that could tell him anything Nora's scanner had not already found. He just stood there, looking at the glyphs, and felt that feeling again. The one from the navigation deck. The feeling of something waiting. He reached out and put his hand against the panel. Not in the center where Selvara had pressed. Near the edge, near a cluster of glyphs that were smaller than the others, and carved more softly, like something written quickly by someone who was leaving, and wanted to say one more thing before they went. Beneath his hand, one glyph pulsed. Once, soft and warm, like a single heartbeat. Then it went still. Calvin lowered his hand and walked back to the scout craft. He did not mention what had happened. He was not sure he had the right words for it yet. Nora was the only one who had turned back in time to see it. She stood near the entrance of the craft and watched Calvin's face as he came aboard. But she opened her field journal and wrote 3 words at the bottom of the day's entry, and underlined them. The words were, "He is different." She did not know yet exactly what she meant by that, but she wrote it down anyway, because Nora Bain had learned a long time ago that the things you could not explain yet were usually the ones most worth keeping track of. The scout craft returned to the ardent horizon as the corridor's distant star began to dim in the viewport. The signal outside had changed. It was still repeating, but it was slightly faster now than it had been before. as if something had been reminded that it was waiting. The human took the strike meant for her, and an ancient power awakened. Part 3. The Strike. The diplomatic sessions resumed the next morning. Nobody talked about the structure. That was not an official decision. Nobody said, "Let's not talk about this." It just happened the way things sometimes do on a ship with many different species aboard, where every group had its own reasons for silence. The Aelthori were quiet because Selvara had not filed a report yet, and did not want the discovery discussed before she had shaped the narrative. The Soon were quiet because they were always quiet. The Draveth envoy had not been on the away team, and had not been told where the ship had gone. Ashford had told him the delay was a sensor calibration. The Draveth accepted this with the thin smile of someone who did not believe it, but had decided not to press. The council chamber on the ardent horizon was a round room. The table was round. The chairs were designed to accommodate 6 different body types. The lighting was set to a neutral spectrum that no single species found fully comfortable, which was, according to the ship's diplomatic protocol guide, intentional. Discomfort, the guide explained, kept everyone slightly humble. Calvin sat in his usual spot, 1 seat behind Selvara and to her left. His job during the sessions was to observe, take notes, and pass her information when she needed it. He had a small datapad in his hand and a pen behind his ear that he never used but always brought, out of habit. The Draveth envoy was a male named Orvan. He was wide across the shoulders, with dark gray skin and eyes the color of old bronze. He had been for most of the voyage difficult in a professional way. He questioned procedural points. He requested amendments to agenda items. He made the sessions longer without technically breaking any rules. Calvin had noted, early on, that Orvan was not trying to derail the talks. He was trying to wear down the other parties until they agreed to terms the Draveth preferred. It was a strategy. It was not a nice strategy, but it was a real one, and it told Calvin that the Draveth actually wanted a deal. They just wanted it on their terms. That morning's session was about corridor access rights. It was the 3rd session on that topic. They had made some progress on the second one, and Selvara had been cautiously optimistic the previous evening when she and Calvin had reviewed the notes. She had said the Suan might move on the transit fee structure if the Mirek agreed to a joint patrol arrangement. Calvin had said he thought the Mirek observer was open to it, based on the way he had responded to a side comment Ashford had made during a recess. Selvara had looked at him for a moment and then said, "That is a useful observation." She had already turned away. The session started normally. Orvan made his usual procedural comment. The Suan delegate, whose name was long and translated roughly to still water, made a counterpoint. The Mirek observer, as always, said nothing audible, but his body shifted twice in ways Calvin's notes flagged as engaged. Then, 40 minutes into the session, Selvara put forward a proposal about shared monitoring of the corridor's central passage. It was a good proposal. Calvin had helped draft it the night before. It was balanced. It gave each party something. It was the kind of language that could move things forward. Orvan listened to it. His face did not change. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both reasonable, and then he reached into the inner pocket of his formal jacket. Calvin's eyes moved to Orvan's hand. The motion was small. Most people in the room were still looking at the table display. But Calvin was watching Orvan, because he had learned in 11 months of diplomatic work that the moment a session shifts is almost never loud. It is almost always in a small motion, a slight change, a hand moving somewhere it was not before. The weapon was small, flat, silver, no longer than a palm, an energy pistol of a type used in close-range personal defense. It was not the kind of weapon you brought to a diplomatic session for show. It was the kind you brought to use. Orvan brought it up fast. He leveled it at Selvara. The room did not have time to process it before Calvin was already moving. He was not a soldier. He had a sidearm in a holster on his right hip that he had fired a total of 12 times in a practice range over the course of his career. He had never drawn it in a real situation. He did not draw it now. His body moved before his mind gave it instructions, stepping sideways and forward at the same time, putting himself between the weapon and Selvara. The shot hit him in the upper chest, just below the left shoulder. The sound was not loud. Energy pistols rarely were. There was a sharp crack, a brief brightness, and then Calvin was on the floor. The room came apart after that. Security officers were moving. Someone was shouting in the Dravith language. The Mirek observer had stood up and knocked his chair back. Still water from the Soon was pressed against the far wall. 2 officers had Orvan pinned to the table within seconds. Someone pulled the weapon from his hand. Someone else was calling medical on a comm unit. Lou Ashford crossed the room in 4 steps and was on his knees next to Calvin before most people had fully understood what had happened. Selvara had not moved. She stood exactly where she had been standing when the shot fired. She looked down at Calvin on the floor, and her expression was not readable in any way that Calvin, if he had been conscious enough to see it, would have been able to name. It was not guilt. It was not fear. It was something without a category. The look of someone who has just seen something happen that their entire framework of the world was not built to hold. Nora Bain came through the chamber door at a run, less than 90 seconds later, medkit already open. She dropped beside Calvin and began working. His eyes were open but not focused. His breathing was rough and shallow. The entry wound was bad, but not unsurvivable. Nora had seen worse. She had treated worse. Her hands were steady and fast, and she did not look up from her work. Calvin's right hand was flat on the floor. His fingers moved slightly. Not from pain, just from the small, involuntary movement of a body trying to feel where it was. His fingertips pressed against the floor of the council chamber. And in the Veth corridor, a long way from the ardent horizon, but not as far as it had been before, every glyph on every wall of the ancient structure lit up at once. The light poured out of it into the dark, in every direction. It was not an explosion. It made no sound that any sensor could read as a wave or a signal. It was more like the moment a window opens in a dark room. Just light, sudden and total, reaching outward in silence. On the ardent horizon, every screen on the navigation deck went bright at the same time. The officer on duty said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then she opened a channel to the captain and said with impressive calm for someone whose hands were shaking, "Commander Ashford, the structure is active." Ashford, still on his knees next to Calvin, closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and said, "Understood. Hold position." Nora pressed a seal pad to Calvin's wound and heard him make a small sound that was probably an attempt at a word. She leaned close to him and said, quietly, "You're going to be fine. Don't talk." He looked at her with those math-doing eyes, and she could see him trying to be fine about it all, the way he was fine about most things, with the quiet and stubborn patience of someone who had decided a long time ago that making a fuss was not worth the energy. Selvara took 1 step toward him, just 1. Then she stopped. She stood there with her hands at her sides, and her silver eyes on the human lying on the floor, who had stepped in front of a weapon that had been meant for her, for no reason she could calculate, with no angle she could identify, with nothing to gain and everything to lose. She stood there for a long time. Outside the ship, the light kept spreading. The human took the strike meant for her, and an ancient power awakened. Part 4, What Woke Up. Every light on the ardent horizon went out. Not for long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But in those seconds, the ship was completely dark. No screens, no running lights, no hum from the engine room. The kind of silence that makes a person aware, all at once, of how much empty space surrounds a ship, and how thin the walls really are. Then the power returned. Everything came back on, one system at a time, like a person waking up slowly from a deep sleep. The screens flickered, the lights steadied, the engine hum returned, slightly lower in pitch than before, as if the ship itself had exhaled. On the navigation deck, every display was showing the same thing. The structure in the corridor was changing. Panels along its outer surface had begun to rotate. Large sections that had been flat against the body of the structure were extending outward, unfolding like the parts of something that had been packed away for a long journey, and was now, finally, being unpacked. Towers rose from the upper section. Long curved arms extended from the lower body. The shape of the structure was becoming something else, something larger, something that the ship's computer tried to classify 3 times, and each time returned a single word: unknown. It was not a weapon. The sensors were clear on that. There was no buildup of energy toward any kind of discharge. There was no targeting system, no propulsion aimed at the ardent horizon, no signal that read as a threat. It was simply waking up. That was the only word that fit. The structure was waking up, slowly and calmly, as if it had all the time in the world, and was in no particular hurry to be anything other than what it was. In the council chamber, Orvin had been taken to a secure room by security officers. The other delegates had been escorted to their quarters, except for Selvara, who had not moved from the spot where she had been standing when Calvin was shot. She was still there when Commander Ashford came back into the room after issuing orders to the navigation deck. Ashford looked at her. Selvara looked at him. He said, "You should go to your quarters." She said, "No." He considered arguing, then he decided it was not worth the time. He looked at the viewport at the back of the chamber, where the distant glow of the structure was visible now, just barely, a faint brightness at the edge of visible range. He put his hands in his pockets and stood next to her and said nothing else. Nora had moved Calvin to the medical bay 2 corridors down. The wound was serious, but the seal had held, and the worst of it had been contained. He was conscious, though not fully. He was in the middle space between sleep and waking, where the body is doing most of the hard work and the mind is just trying to stay out of the way. Nora sat beside his bed, with a cup of tea she was not drinking, and her field journal open on her knee. She was writing about the structure. She was writing about the glyph that had pulsed under Calvin's hand. She was writing carefully, the way she always did, making sure each word was exactly what she meant, and nothing extra. The ship's oldest Aelthori scholar came into the medical bay without knocking. He was very old, even by Aelthori standards, and he had been so quiet for the entire voyage that Calvin had once told Nora he had almost forgotten Korath was aboard. Korath was not on the diplomatic team. He was listed in the ship's manifest as an academic observer, which was the kind of title that usually meant someone important had arranged for someone old to have a safe place to travel. He had sat in the back of every session and said nothing. He looked at Calvin for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. He said, "May I sit?" Nora gestured to the chair on the other side of the bed. Korath sat slowly, the way very old things move, and folded his long hands in his lap. He said, "I know what that structure is." Nora looked at him. He said, "I have known for many years. I was not certain this corridor was the right one. There are several candidates in historical records. But when the signal came through, and you found what was there, I became certain." He paused. "I should have said something sooner. I want you to understand that my silence was not malice. It was caution. And I will admit, privately, it was also fear." Nora put her journal down. "Tell me," she said. The civilization that had built the structure had called themselves the Veth. This was the same word that had been given to the corridor, though most people in the current era did not know the connection. The Veth had been the oldest known spacefaring species in this region of the galaxy. They had come before the HFY, before all of the current major civilizations, by a margin that Korath said was difficult to put into words without making it sound invented. They had been extraordinary, not because of their technology, though their technology was remarkable, because of what they chose to do with the time they had. They had spent their last few thousand years resolving conflicts, not their own, other species. They had moved through the galaxy, finding civilizations on the edge of destroying themselves or each other, and they had helped them find other ways, not by force, not by threat, by understanding things deeply enough to say the right things at the right times to the right people. And then they had left, not died, left. They had gone somewhere that no current civilization had been able to trace. And they had left behind a single structure, a kind of inheritance. Korath said the HFY had known about it for 4,000 years and had searched for it without success. He said that several HFY expeditions had found structures they believed were the one, but none had ever activated, because the structure had a condition. Korath said the condition was recorded in a text so old that most HFY scholars considered it figurative rather than literal. The text described what the Veth called the gift without reason, an act given freely, not from duty, not from agreement, not from love or loyalty or any bond that existed before the moment. An act given to a stranger for nothing, because the alternative was simply not acceptable to the person giving it. The HFY had never been able to produce this. Korath said this without embarrassment, simply as a fact. They were a people of great honor, great tradition, great depth of feeling, but their acts of sacrifice were always earned, always within a framework of meaning, always connected to something. They had tried many times to recreate the condition, but the structure had never responded. "We did not understand," Korath said quietly, "that the condition could not be recreated. It had to be real." Nora looked at Calvin. Calvin had not woken fully. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow. Korath said, "He did not know her. They have worked alongside one another for 4 days, and she has, I observed, treated him as something slightly less than an equal, and he stepped in front of the shot anyway, not because of a rule, not because of a code, not because he had decided to. He just did it." He paused. "The Veth, I think, were looking for that, something that did not need a reason." Ashford came into the medical bay. He stood at the end of the bed and said, "The structure has stopped changing. It's holding a new configuration, and there is something in the center of it that our sensors are reading as a presence. Not a life form, exactly, but not empty either." Korath nodded. "The caretaker," he said. Ashford looked at him. "What is that?" "The Veth's word for what they left behind to manage the inheritance, a kind of keeper. It has been waiting inside that structure for 4,000 years for the condition to be met." Korath looked at Calvin again. "It is waiting now for the person who met it." Nora said, "To do what?" Korath said, "To receive what the Veth left behind." The lights in the medical bay changed slightly. It was not a flicker. It was more like the quality of the light shifted, became warmer and more even, as if the room had taken a breath. And in the center of the room, in the empty space above Calvin's bed, something began to form. It had no body. It was made of light, but not the harsh flat light of the ship's systems. It was layered, moving slowly within itself, warm and deep in the way that firelight is deep. It was roughly the height and width of a person standing. It had no face and no clear edges. But it was paying attention. That much was plain. It was paying attention in the way that a person pays attention, with focus and presence, aimed directly at the human in the bed below it. Silvara appeared in the doorway. She had followed Ashford without being asked. She stopped when she saw the light. Her expression, for the first time in the entire voyage, had no distance in it. There was nothing professional about the way she looked at that light above Calvin's bed. She looked at it the way someone looks at the answer to a question they had stopped believing could ever be answered. Calvin opened his eyes. He looked up at the light above him for a long moment. Then he said, with the specific low exhaustion of a man who had been shot and had not slept enough, and was now looking at a 4,000-year-old entity made of light, "I probably should have ducked." Nora pressed her hand to her mouth. It was not clear if she was trying not to laugh or not to cry. It may have been both. The light did not move, but something in the room shifted. Something calm and very old and patient settled over the space, like the moment after a long story finally reaches the part it was always heading toward. The caretaker was awake. The human took the strike meant for her, and an ancient power awakened. Part 5. The Inheritance. The caretaker did not speak. It was the first thing Nora wrote in her journal about the experience, and she wrote it at the top of the page and underlined it once, because she felt it was important. People who read the word caretaker would expect something that gave instructions, something that explained rules, something that talked. What the caretaker did was different. It communicated. But the way it communicated was not a language that could be heard. It was more like standing in a room where every object on every shelf had a meaning, and simply being in that room long enough meant the meaning came into you, without noise, without effort, the way warmth comes through a wall from a fire on the other side. Calvin lay in the medical bed and let it happen. He was not sure he had any other option, but even if he had, he thought later, he would have chosen this. There was nothing frightening about it. It was the least frightening thing that had happened to him in the last 24 hours, and that bar was admittedly very low, given that someone had shot him in the chest that morning. The caretaker moved through what it needed to share over the course of several hours. Korath sat in the corner and occasionally spoke quietly, confirming something, translating a concept when the impression alone was not enough. Nora wrote continuously. Ashford stood near the door for the first hour and then sat on the floor with his back against the wall, which was very unlike him, but felt appropriate. Silvara stood at the foot of Calvin's bed the entire time. She did not sit. She did not leave. She watched the light above Calvin, and her expression was the expression of someone hearing, for the first time, music in a language they had always claimed was not worth learning. What the Veth had left behind was not a weapon. This was the first thing the caretaker made clear, and it made it clear in a way that left no doubt. The Veth had decided, before they left, that weapons were not a useful thing to leave to whoever came after them. Power of that kind only moved conflict from one place to another, like pressing on one side of a water-filled bag and watching it bulge on the other. They had not left weapons. They had left a map and a method. The map was not a physical thing, a chart or a file. It was a kind of deep record, a catalog of every ongoing conflict in the inhabited regions of the galaxy, every wound, every old argument that had been buried without being resolved, every place where two civilizations sat next to each other, carrying something between them that neither had ever put into words. The Veth had tracked these things for thousands of years, and they had left that tracking to the caretaker, which had continued it quietly through all the centuries since. The method was harder to describe. Korath spent a long time trying to find words for it, and eventually said it was something like a complete record of every time the Veth had successfully moved a conflict toward peace. Not the political details, not the treaty language, the human details. What had been said, how it had been said, what the person on the other side of the table had actually been afraid of, underneath all the formal language, where the real stuck place was, in every situation. And what kind of gesture, what kind of word, what kind of quiet human or Veth act had been the thing that moved it? 4,000 years of that. Detailed, organized, patient. And the caretaker intended to give all of it to Calvin Reyes. When Nora understood what was happening, she put her pen down and looked at Calvin's face. He looked calm, a little pale from the wound, but calm. His eyes were closed and his breathing was even, and he looked like a man who had accepted something very large, with a great deal less drama than the thing probably deserved. She said, "You understand what this is?" He opened his eyes. He said, "I think so." She said, "This is the most significant diplomatic resource in the history of the galactic community. It's 4,000 years of peace-building knowledge from a civilization that figured out how to do it better than anyone alive." He said, "I know." She said, "And they're giving it to you." He said, "I know." She said, "You fixed an air recycler on Deck 4 last week because the maintenance officer was on break, and you didn't want to bother anyone." He thought about this. Then he said, "The air recycler needed fixing." She picked her pen back up. She wrote, "This is exactly why." The caretaker's presence in the room faded slowly over the last hour, not leaving exactly, but receding to something smaller and quieter, like a fire settling from its first bright height into a steady, manageable warmth. Korath said this was normal. He said the Veth's texts described the transfer as a beginning, not an ending. The caretaker would remain accessible to the person who had received the inheritance, in the way that a very old and very knowledgeable friend remains accessible, not controlling, not directing, simply present when needed. The diplomatic sessions aboard the Ardent Horizon resumed 2 days later. The circumstances of the restart were unusual. Orvin had been held in a secure room since the shooting, and was expecting, at a minimum, to be returned to Dravet space in disgrace. Instead, Ashford went to see him personally. He sat with him for 2 hours. Nora later asked Ashford what had been said in that room, and Ashford thought about it for a moment and said, "I found out what he was actually afraid of." He did not elaborate. But Orvin came to the next session and sat down, and for the first time in the voyage, made no procedural objections. Calvin was not in the sessions for the first 2 days. He was still in the medical bay, resting, following Nora's instructions with more discipline than anyone had expected from him. But on the 3rd day he came back to his seat, slightly slower than before, his left arm in a light support, and he opened his datapad and put his pen behind his ear and was ready. Selvara looked at him when he sat down. She looked at him for 3 seconds, which was a long time for her. Then she turned to face the table. The talks moved forward. They moved forward in ways that surprised all the senior delegates, including the ones who had been doing this for decades. Small things shifted. An old argument about corridor access that had been stuck for 3 sessions suddenly found a path through when someone noticed. Calvin noticed that the Mirex position was not about the access itself, but about a small historical incident that had never been formally acknowledged. He wrote a note and passed it to Selvara. She read it and looked at him once, and then raised the point in the session with the kind of careful, respectful language the Mirek responded to. The Mirek observer, for the first time in the entire voyage, spoke at length. These things kept happening. Small things, patient things, things that required paying close attention to people and taking them seriously at the level of what they actually felt, rather than what they formally said. It was not magic. It was not even dramatic. It was just work, done carefully, with a set of tools that nobody else in the room had access to. Selvara requested a private meeting with Calvin on the 4th evening. They sat in one of the small rooms off the main corridor. Selvara sat across from Calvin with her hands on the table, and she looked at him in the direct, unguarded way she had been looking at him since the day in the medical bay. The way that had no category in it, just a question. She said, "Among my people, what you did in the council chamber has a name." He waited. She said, "The phrase translates, as close as I can manage, to the unnecessary gift. It describes an act given with no reason, nothing owed, nothing gained. We have a word for it because our philosophers discussed it as a concept for many centuries. It was considered a theoretical ideal, something that could be described but not actually performed, because any real act always has a reason underneath it, even if the person performing it cannot name the reason." She paused. "We believed this for 4,000 years, Calvin said. "And now?" Then she said, "Now I am reconsidering several things." He did not push her further. He did not ask her to resolve it into something tidy. He just sat with her, in the quiet, while she reconsidered. And that was also, in its own small way, the kind of work the Veth had known how to do. The Ardent Horizon left the Veth corridor 8 days later with a preliminary ceasefire agreement signed by all 3 factions. It was not a final treaty, it was a beginning. But it was a real one, built on things that had actually been said and actually heard, and it held. Behind the ship, the ancient structure moved, not quickly, not urgently, but it was no longer drifting. It was following, at a distance, steady and patient, like something that knew where it needed to be and was in no hurry, because it had already waited a very long time. Nora wrote the last entry in her field journal that evening, sitting at her small desk in the lower deck with a cup of tea that was, for once, still warm. She wrote, "Humanity has been part of this galaxy for 31 years. We have no ancient archives, no pre-collapse history, no 1,000-year traditions of diplomacy or philosophy or formal grace. We do not carry the weight of that kind of time. What we apparently carry instead is the ability to step in front of something without stopping to ask why. I do not know if that is enough to do everything the Veth hoped would be done, but I think it might be a start." She closed the journal. Outside the viewport, the corridor's distant stars sat cold and far away. And somewhere behind the ship, moving quietly through the dark, a 4,000-year inheritance followed the Ardent Horizon home. The human took the strike meant for her, and an ancient power awakened. Part 1. The Way to First Contact. The stars outside the viewport did not move. They never did, not really. They just sat there, cold and far away, like old men who had seen everything and had nothing left to say. Calvin Reyes stood at the viewport for a long moment, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He was not a tall man. He was not a wide man either. He had dark hair, a plain face, and the kind of eyes that looked like they were always doing math quietly behind them. He was 34 years old, and he had been in space for 11 months. He missed his mother's cooking. He missed the rain. He missed the sound of traffic at night. But he was here, and that meant something. The ship was called the Ardent Horizon. It was a joint interspecies diplomatic cruiser, which was a very long way of saying that it carried people from 6 different civilizations who mostly did not like each other. And it asked them to sit in rooms together and talk until they stopped wanting to kill one another. It was not the most glamorous job in the galaxy, but someone had to do it. Calvin was a human liaison officer. His job was to serve as a bridge between the human delegation and the other species aboard. He kept records. He translated tone. He noticed when someone's posture changed before their words did. He was good at it, though nobody ever said so out loud. There were only 2 humans on the Ardent Horizon. Calvin was one. The other was Dr. Nora Bain, a xenobiologist who worked in the lower decks and spoke very little unless she had something precise to say. She reminded him of a library that had decided to become a person. The other species aboard were the Aelthori, the Dravith, the Suin, the Myrick, and the Yoth Collective. Each of them had been in space for hundreds or thousands of years. Each of them had history, traditions, ancient stories, old wars, and older peace treaties. The HFY in particular were the kind of species that wore their age like a crown. They were tall, silver-skinned, and moved with the slow confidence of people who had never once doubted that the universe had been arranged with them in mind. Calvin's assigned partner was an HFY advisor named Selvara. She was not warm. She was not cold either exactly. She was simply distant, the way a mountain is distant. She looked at Calvin the way someone looks at a new piece of furniture they did not order and are not sure where to put. She answered his questions. She attended the briefings he organized. She never once said anything rude to his face. But he could feel it, the quiet weight of her opinion, sitting just behind her silver eyes. Humans were young. Humans were fragile. Humans had been part of the galactic community for only 31 years, which, to a species like the HFY, was barely a breath. They had not yet earned the right to sit at the big table, in her view. And yet here one was, standing next to her, drinking cold coffee, and asking if she had reviewed the morning's diplomatic notes. She always said yes. She had always reviewed them. She just did not see why he needed to ask. Calvin did not push back. That was not his way. He simply kept showing up, kept learning, kept trying small things. He learned the correct angle to hold his head when greeting an HFY elder. He learned which topics were considered private and which were open for discussion. He brought Selvara a document once about HFY water memory customs, not because it was required of him, but because he had read it and thought she might find it interesting that a human had taken the time. She took the document without comment, but she did read it. He saw her reading it later, and he said nothing about that either. The ship moved through space toward the Veth Corridor. The Veth Corridor was a long stretch of space that sat between three civilizations who had been fighting over it for decades. The Draveth Collective claimed it for trade routes. The Soon said it was sacred. The Mirrek simply wanted it because the Draveth wanted it, and they had a long history of disagreeing with the Draveth on principle. The Ardent Horizons mission was to bring representatives of all three factions together, facilitate a ceasefire, and begin laying the groundwork for a formal treaty. It was, in other words, a very hard job in a very dangerous place, with very little margin for error. The ship's captain was Commander Lou Ashford. He was human, which had itself been a small political incident when the mission was assigned. Several species had objected. The HFY had lodged a formal complaint with the Joint Council. But the Joint Council had reviewed Ashford's record, 3 prior first contact events, 2 successful, and they had made their decision. Ashford was quiet about it. He did not gloat. He just ran the ship the way he always did, with the steady, unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped needing anyone's approval. Calvin watched Ashford sometimes during briefings, and thought that was probably the most human thing a person could do. Not fighting to prove something, just doing the job until the job was done. On the 4th day out from the last relay station, the morning diplomatic session went badly. It was not a dramatic failure. It was the quiet kind, which Calvin had learned was often worse. The Draveth envoy had made a comment about the Soon's territorial claims. The Soon delegate had responded. The Mirrek observer had said nothing, but had shifted in a way that the room's body language monitors flagged as escalation. The session ended 30 minutes early. Nobody shouted. Nobody stormed out. But when Calvin walked out of the chamber behind Selvara, he could feel the session's failure hanging in the corridor like bad air. Selvara paused near the junction that led to her quarters. She did not look at Calvin. She looked at the wall, which was what she did sometimes when she was thinking. She said, "Your captain allowed the Draveth envoy to speak for 4 minutes over the agreed time limit." Calvin said, "Yes." He was watching the Soon delegate's hands. He thought cutting the envoy off early would make things worse. Salvara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was a reasonable read. It was not a compliment exactly, but it was the closest thing to one she had given him in 4 days." Calvin filed it away without showing anything on his face. That evening, as the ship crossed into the outer edge of the Veth corridor, an alert sounded through the lower decks. It was not a warning alert. It was the kind of soft, repeating tone the ship used when it detected something unexpected that did not yet qualify as a threat. Calvin was still at his desk when Nora Bain appeared in his doorway. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were doing something else entirely. She said, "You need to come see this." He followed her down to the navigation deck. The rest of the crew on shift was gathered around a central display. On the screen was a signal. It was old. The wave pattern was unlike anything in the ship's database. The navigation system had tried to classify it twice and returned an error both times. Then, on the third attempt, it had pulled up a single tag from its oldest archived file. The tag was short. It read, "Origin Pre-Collapse Era." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Lou Ashford walked in from the back of the room, looked at the screen, looked at the people standing around it, and said, quietly, "Well, that's new." Calvin looked at the signal on the screen, and felt something he could not name. Not fear, not excitement, something older and simpler than both. The feeling of a door, somewhere, waiting to be knocked on. He did not know yet that he was the one who was going to knock.